This is a presentation around the cost of mold-related illness and indoor dampness to our society. This is a conversation to ask public health officials to start recognizing this as a major public health threat and to start taking action to mitigate this exposure and the health-related costs. This presentation will start with an overview of how this may be impacting our society, cover detailed mechanisms and epidemiological data that demonstrates this risk, and then conclude with suggestions on how we can take further steps. I've spent the last 15 years in pediatric integrative medicine, and I've seen a lot of patients with a lot of chronic disease. Nothing, absolutely nothing has caused greater concern than mold. And since I have been focused on mold over the last 7 to 8 years, I have become even more concerned over what it's doing. There are many of us that believe upwards of 50% of autism is mold toxicity. Many adult practitioners are finding a plethora of autoimmune disease and neurodegenerative disease to be tied to mold toxicity. A high percentage of the severe asthmatics that are in and out of the ICU, that are in and out of the emergency department, is likely due to indoor dampness and exposure. This presentation will cover all of that and impress upon you the need why urgent action is needed for us to start understanding this better and taking at least the preliminary steps to understand the total risk and cost to our society. The reality is where we are now is where we were in the 1970s and 80s with cigarette smoke, where doctors were coming on TV and smoking cigarettes and saying Camels are my favorite cigarettes. The way that people were smoking on airplanes, smoking in restaurants, and we never thought twice the harm that was coming from that smoke. Except the reality is that when you look at the mechanisms, when you look at the literature, when you look at the scientific data, the risk that is coming from indoor air contamination is likely far, far higher than what we were experiencing from cigarette smoke. And yet we're completely missing it and completely overlooking it. We take 20,000 breaths per day, and over 90% of that happens in our indoor environments. So if there's any kind of significant contamination, we are breathing in that contamination all the time. That's like having a chain smoker in your wall, releasing all kinds of rather dangerous compounds that disrupt the immune system, disrupt the mitochondria, disrupt detoxification pathways, disrupt the gastrointestinal tract, impact the nervous system directly. And we will go through all of these studies in this presentation. That chain smoker is in your wall and is releasing these toxin compounds into the breathable air every moment of every day, except we can't smell it, we can't see it, and most of the time it is overlooked and missed. How does it happen? It's really simple. When we created sheetrock, we did something that was not entirely intelligent. We wrapped the sheetrock, the calcium carbonate, in paper. That paper comes from tree bark. Tree bark has mold spores embedded in it. So all sheetrock that is in every single home has mold spores embedded into its matrix. So when you add any kind of significant humidity, whether it's a water event, such as a leak, whether it's a weather event like flooding, or in areas where humidity levels go up to 90% and those poor individuals do not have air conditioning units to dehumidify the air, and now you add a cupboard next to the wall so additional moisture is trapped, you get mold. And it can show up anywhere. It can be in carpets, it can be in cavities, it can be in subfloors. Now, what makes this problem worse is up until 20, 30 years ago, homes leaked. Homes were not airtight, and therefore there was a constant flow of air. Over the last 20 years, for the sake of energy efficiency, what we have done is completely insulate these homes, making them completely airtight for the most part, which means that whatever toxicity is in that home remains in that home, and it circulates in that home and congregates and builds up in that home. Hence why we are now seeing a greater degree of problems than we have ever seen. And there are multiple other reasons beyond that where other environmental compounds and toxins are reducing our ability and resiliency to handle this toxicity. Part of the problem that we also have is this false sense of safety. Take, for example, indoor assessments. One, most indoor assessments inspectors are very poorly trained, and we will talk about that. And these poorly trained inspectors basically go take one air sample from the garden and then come and take one air sample from inside the home, typically one air sample for one large living area. And if the garden is found to have more mold than the inside environment, they conclude there is no mold. Except when you look at how these mold spores, not toxins, because we're not able to measure toxins through this, so all we're measuring are the actual spores. When you look at how mold spores travel, how they behave, most mold spores, unless someone comes with a leaf blower and starts mixing up the air to disperse it equally in the environment, most mold spores only travel a few inches. Therefore, if you've got water contamination in this wall or this wall, those mold spores will travel only a few inches. So if someone is measuring 10 feet away from that area, the likelihood of them getting a very high reading, which would then cause them to become concerned, is low. So we are missing indoor contamination all the time because of some of these simple oversights that are happening because people are not properly trained, and we will talk about that. This study cited through the Institute of Medicine, and I would highly recommend anyone who is interested to look at this substantial publication that was released in 2004, talks about how the common methods for assessing fungal contamination do not directly or effectively correlate with the exposures that are happening to the human beings. And this is despite essentially 1 in 3 homes in the United States having contamination. You can see it changes depending on the environment and where it is, and chances are other areas are even higher. And you compare that to how many homes have significant lead contamination, such as within the lead pipes. You can see the sheer scale of this problem. You add to that weather events, such as flooding, and the rates of mold and indoor dampness go up to essentially 1 in 2 homes, with 1 in 5 homes having severe contamination. And some would argue that these estimates are probably far lower than they should be. Taking Florida as a state, as a case example, 41% of Florida is flood prone, and over the last 40 years, Florida has had essentially 70 large and concerning weather events, which means that a lot of homes have been affected by these different types of weather events. Yet when you look at the data, only 1 in 10 homes have flood insurance, which means there are probably a lot of people who have had some kind of water damage, known water damage, and they looked at it and said, well, we don't have the money to fix that, so therefore we will just live with it. Except now one child is having asthma, another child is having learning difficulties, and we're going to get into all of these mechanisms later on. One parent is becoming disabled because of chronic migraines, because of chronic fatigue. And we are missing these connections because physicians are not trained to look for this. So when these patients go into their doctors and say, hey, I've got this issue or that issue, no one's saying, hey, did you have flooding in your home because our community got flooded? These connections are not being made, and therefore these health risks and health disabilities are unfolding underneath our noses, and no one is paying attention to it. In New Orleans, when a flooding event took place, the rates of autism went up threefold. A threefold increase in autism due to weather events. Now, the authors in this study attributed that to psychological stress, but we know that there was also a substantial amount of mold in these homes that the families did not have the means to remediate. And the saddest part is the people who are being impacted the most are our most vulnerable members of society, the low income individuals who do not have the means to take care of this. Most of these individuals are probably renting, and landlords are notoriously bad at addressing any kind of water damage because at the end of the day, they're renting because they want to make money. And if something impacts their bottom line, they're going to do the least necessary steps to take care of that. And what I've seen in Los Angeles, in nice rental properties, supposedly clean rental properties that are going for $4,000 to $12,000, $15,000 per month, the prevalence of mold in these rental properties is approximately 50%. And what they found in this low income study in Seattle was that 77% of these low income individuals probably had mold exposure. And we are missing this. No one is talking about this. No one is looking at this. And part of what I will demonstrate to you in this presentation is what cost physiologically, pathophysiologically comes from this exposure. When there's a water event, when there is a humidity problem, it is not just the mycotoxins that become an issue. And this is something that gets misstated. When there is some kind of moisture problem, you get multiple molds with multiple mycotoxins, various types of bacteria that are then releasing bacterial endotoxins that are highly toxic. And just like mycotoxins and these endotoxins, and I'll demonstrate this later, these can be inhaled, these can go systemic, they can show up in the bloodstream, and they can cause significant harm to the human beings who are being exposed. There are various kinds of microbial particulates and volatile compounds that are also released. And these are the things that we know. Studies are demonstrating that these fungi, these microorganisms are releasing compounds that we still probably do not well understand. And the combination of all of these different toxins is causing toxicity at substantially low levels. So when you look at most of the studies that take one mycotoxin and they expose an animal to that mycotoxin and say, well, at this level, this didn't cause any disease, even though they only exposed the animal for a day or a week. That in of itself is flawed because there is never just one mycotoxin that is released into the environment. And then when you look at environmental methods, we're not looking for these microbial compounds. We're not looking for the mycotoxins in the environment. We're looking for the spores. And part of what I will also demonstrate later on is the spores grossly miss and underrepresent the toxins that are there by 500-fold. These are things that we are not paying attention to and we are overlooking, and it is causing our society to become extremely sick. This is a study of 270 Polish students who were exposed to mold in their homes. And what they found within a 2-year period of time was a 10-point IQ decrease due to this exposure. These toxins can cause mental confusion, they can change mental status, they can cause altered attention, blunted executive functioning, faulty short-term memory. And I see this all the time. This for me is not abstract. I see this in every child that I see for consultation where these kids just can't focus, they can't learn, they're struggling with math, they're calling themselves dumb, they're giving up on school. And these are all the societal costs that are happening because of this exposure that we have yet to understand. This is another study looking at individuals who are exposed. Cognition takes a big hit when there is exposure. And for those people who have been exposed and feel this, they cannot appreciate what is happening. And one thing I want to highlight was the relative risk. And I will demonstrate to you other studies that show this kind of high risk when this exposure takes place. This is a summary of multiple different studies. Also, looking at how cognition is impacted, particularly in children, when they're exposed. We're robbing these children of their entire future. We're robbing these children of their ability to succeed because of this exposure, and it is happening even more in the low-income individuals who don't have the means or ability to protect themselves from this exposure. I want to help you see just one physiological mechanism to help you appreciate the total risk that is happening as a result of this. Mycotoxins and other toxins, including bacterial endotoxins, and I'll discuss those later in this presentation, cause a powerful activation of the microglia. And you can see it's not one study, multiple studies. They cause a powerful activation of our neuroglia, our brain inflammatory immune system. Now, why is that important? Microglial activation underpins the neurophysiological mechanism of why ADHD unfolds because of the disruption to the dopamine 1 receptors, but multiple other mechanisms on top of that. And when you look at, well, if you just look at ADHD, forget about the processing issues, the memory problems. If you look at just ADHD, and usually all of these other things come with that, ultimately these children give up on school. Because they give up on school and they give up on themselves, they have a much higher risk of ultimately entering into criminal behavior. 15,000 children with ADHD, twofold higher risk of arrests, convictions, and incarcerations. And the kids who are being affected the most are those kids who are in low-income homes. And I see this all the time. Every single child that I see who struggles badly with learning, they can't learn, they can't remember, they can't process, they can't focus, have had mold exposure. It's far worse than lead exposure. It's far worse than any other toxin that's out there. These kids are getting robbed of their futures, and we're allowing that to happen because of our ignorance to this problem. The same microglial activation can ultimately change neuronal circuitry, and there's multiple published studies talking about this, which I will explore later on in this presentation, that changes how we process sensory information and emotional inputs that can cause autism. Dr. Theo Hrades is publishing extensively on this, and the studies that he has put out are concerning, to say the least. And this gentleman, who's published over 270 scientific papers, says that over 50% of autism is likely related to this exposure. Autism comes at a horrendous cost. Forget about the human cost. Forget about the family cost. Forget about the parents who essentially give up working because they need to take care of their kids. But we're spending close to $500 billion on autism to taking care of these kids. The total lifetime cost for autism is over $3 million and is projected to be up to $15 trillion by 2029. When you look at the cost of special services these kids need, the aids, because there are some kids who will not sit still, will constantly run out of the classroom, constantly harming themselves. If 50% of that is due to this exposure, should we not be paying attention? Except we're not even looking at this. We're not even expending any energy to really study this link. And what I see in my practice is exactly what Dr. Theo Hrades is talking about, that upwards of 50% of kids who present with autism actually have mold toxicity. And I'll demonstrate to you some of the mechanisms why that's the case. The scientific literature has a lot of data that is very troubling once you come to understand it. Anything that disrupts the microglia ultimately increases the risk to psychiatric disorders, and I will talk about this at length later on in this presentation. The part that gets really concerning is that significant acute exposure is sufficient to cause long-term disease via changes to the gastrointestinal tract and the immune system. So for some individuals, they go live in a moldy home for 2 to 3 years. They may realize that they're getting sick, so they move. But that illness, whether it presents as ADHD, as autism, as abnormal immune responses, as chronic fatigue, Autoimmunity persists well after this exposure. And I see this all the time. And again, we will talk about the mechanisms why this happens in this presentation. The reality is we don't know what the total cost of indoor dampness and mold-related illness is. But the reality is that it's probably far higher than we can imagine. And it's probably far higher than anything that cigarette smoke exposure was causing. If we spent just 10% of the total cost that is currently related to taking care of these individuals who have been exposed, how many kids could we help? How many people could we prevent from getting sick? How many adults could have a bright and healthier future? And I don't want to use this as a hypothetical. What I would like to do is help you see this in real terms by using a very conservative measure, which is asthma. So, according to our federal government, infants who have been exposed to mold have a 3 times higher risk of developing asthma. And there are multiple other studies that demonstrate a much higher risk of asthma in individuals who have been exposed. Using conservative figures, very conservative figures of just 21% of asthmatics in the US are related to indoor dampness. That puts us at around 4.6 million cases of asthma due to indoor dampness, which translates into at least $3.5 billion per year. And other studies through my friends and colleagues at Change the Air Foundation can go up to 38 billion. If you add other indoor contaminants, such as gases that are released from improper ventilation, rodents and cockroaches, that cost goes up to $81 billion just related to asthma because of indoor air contamination. In Florida, just the emergency room visits related to asthma are $430 million per year, just the ER visits. And if you were to take those figures and say, what could we do if we just dedicated 20% of just the emergency room costs that we are incurring to help people have healthier homes? And using rounded numbers, let's say, and these are fairly accurate, for $1,000, you can have a home inspected with relative accuracy. For $5,000, if that inspection turned abnormal, you can send someone into the home to educate the people that are living in the home how to properly clean that home and mitigate that exposure and buy these individuals powerful and effective HEPA filters that can mitigate that exposure. Depending on the size of the home and the contamination, homes could be fully remediated from $10,000 upwards of $100,000, and the upwards of $100,000 would be putting everything back, not just ripping things out. And imagine if the government gave subsidized loans to empower homeowners to make these changes. And if the return on investment paid off, the severe asthmatic that was in and out of the ICU, in and out of the emergency department, in and out of the urgent care suddenly was no longer landing in the hospital, not utilizing all these services, that loan could be forgiven. How many lives could we improve just by looking at asthma? And if those funds were going to further reinforce the health of that community, right? Drive additional business, allow people to now get into this business to do the proper thing to help others in their community. How much benefit could we have? If we look at asthma, the likelihood is that the return on investment would be at least twofold. And if other indoor contaminants, cockroaches, rat droppings, improper ventilation were addressed, that goes up to 5 to 14-fold. If autism and other chronic illnesses are indeed due to this exposure, and we take care of that, the likelihood is that the return on investment also goes at least 5 to 10-fold, if not higher. We need to start looking at these public health threats, these public health risks in these ways, and instead of just spending money treating the outcomes, understanding how to prevent them. If we took the $1,000 per inspection, that means at $100 million per year, 1/4 of the cost of the emergency room visits related to asthma, we could have 100,000 homes just in Florida inspected per year. If we took the $5,000 per household model to inspect, educate, and filter, we could improve the air quality of 20,000 homes per year just in the state of Florida. The reality is that we need to start looking at this critically, because right now physicians are missing this. Conventional tests, running a CBC with differential, running a metabolic panel, running basic tests completely miss this exposure. In most of the states, including Florida, despite having licensure laws, are creating a scenario where basically someone just pays enough money to the state to get licensed, and that does not mean that they're well qualified. So while Florida law does mandate, using Florida as a case example, does mandate that landlords maintain habitable properties, that they disclose mold, that they inspect it if someone says there's a problem, remediate it, there are all kinds of deficits that are still there. The inspectors are not meeting the minimum for the quality standards that are there for adequate inspections to happen. The remediators are not required to meet certain standards in terms of certification. So when there's a remediation that takes place, and this is across the board in all states, these remediators are also not required to meet certain criteria to be certified. So when they're doing the work, it's done right. And there's no support to help these poor people who are in low-income housing. The Institute of Medicine, in their 2004 amazing publication that has so much wonderful literature, came up with certain recommendations. These are 3 out of the 7 recommendations they came up with. They suggested modification of the regulations, building codes, and other ways to promote indoor environments and enforcement of these rules. Public health-oriented research and various projects to look at the short-term and long-term effectiveness of these intervention strategies, along with education of people living in the homes, health professionals, and others to really start bringing about awareness to start mitigating this exposure. If we just followed these 3 recommendations from the Institute of Medicine, the amount of benefit in terms of health risk and health cost that could come about is tremendous. The rest of this presentation is broken up into 8 parts. First part gets into the exposure risks and why the exposure happens. Part 2 is why are we missing all of this? Why is there so little awareness around all of this? Part 3 gets into the allergies and respiratory problems. Part 4 gets into systemic disease and how mold and indoor dampness causes various types of systemic disease, including autoimmune disease, immune disruption. Part 5 talks about the central nervous system and how indoor dampness can cause abnormalities in the central nervous system, including mental health conditions, neurodegenerative disease, and autism. Part 5 discusses how indoor dampness and these mycotoxins disrupt the gastrointestinal tract. And it is very likely that on top of the systemic immune abnormalities that can persist after the exposure, the changes to the gastrointestinal tract is one reason why individuals stay toxic and sick long after their exposure. Part 7 talks about other health risks, including endocrine disruption, abnormalities in weight gain and nutritional absorption. And then part 8 is the limitations of our diagnostic testing in the clinical environment, and ultimately the conclusion to this presentation. I thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation, and I hope you find the rest of it informative and helpful.